Before I introduce our panel, most of whom I say are known to you anyway, to focus our minds and just to remind us of what resilience means to the very poorest of the poor and the people that you're trying to target, I caught up recently with Concern's country director in Chad, Cardinal Oushaka, and I first asked him, what does resilience mean in a place like Gosbeda, which is a place that they work in?
Yes, for, let's say, a woman in Gosbeda means that whether she misses rains this year or whether there is too much rain this year and her plantation has been flooded, she's still able to feed her children. She's still able to let them access the local clinic if they need to. She's still able to access clean water. She's still able to feed her children as she always does. And she does not have to resort to selling her goats, to selling her cattle, or to marrying off her daughter, or to pulling out some of her children because she's struggling as a result of the shock that she's just endured.
There are coping capacities inside these communities themselves. Can you give us some examples of how people in those societies have their own resilience?
Yeah, in those contexts, the family plays a critical role, the community plays a critical role, and they have what I would call a local or a community social protection mechanism. So they look after their most vulnerable in a way. And when there is a shock or during periods of crisis, the lean period during plantation and before harvest, for instance, they have a communal storage where at harvest they all contribute some of their cereals, and when the most vulnerable are in need, those are assisted through those community contributions. So that's a community way of approaching vulnerability and addressing vulnerability during times of crisis.
Sometimes the shocks are too great, though, for communities to actually absorb and cope with by themselves. How can decision makers build on the strengths that do exist in communities and help them absorb those shocks?
Unfortunately, as you said, the frequency of these shocks have increased and the coping capacities have not increased. So that has created the need or the increased need of perpetual responses, emergency responses to assist those communities. And there's a lot that can be done. A lot that can be done in terms of strengthening local government capacity to be able to provide those basic services, working with communities to improve their production capacities, assisting them to access basic services that are struggling to function.
Does the government in Chad get the concept of resilience? And if so, what kind of backup do they need to actually be able to deliver programs that help build resilience?
There is a realization that resilience is what is needed. There have been evidence that resilience actually works. There is a lack of resources, a lack of funding commitments in the long term, unlike in the emergency situation when you fund for an intervention and that's it. For resilience, you need to be looking at a longer period of time, and you need to be looking at a much wider scope of intervention. So there is that commitment, and the government of Chad has made commitments in the SUN movement. It has made commitments in the Sendai framework on DRR, and it has adopted a number of policies that are resilience conscious. Recently, we've participated in a process to develop the environmental policy where we made contribution from our learning, where we made contribution from research that was produced by our partner, ICRAF. And these policies are progressive. They are addressing the needs of those communities that need to be assisted, that need to strengthen their resilience capacity. And the government of Chad has made those steps.
What about the gap that seems to exist between the policies at a national level and the ability of local government to actually deliver things on the ground? How do you bridge that gap?
Unfortunately, what I see in Chad is a very crying lack of government capacity, particularly at the local government level. Government has no capacity to deploy itself, to reach out to those communities we are talking about, and to be able to provide those basic services, and to be able to assist them in terms of accessing the right information at the right time, and to be able to strengthen their coping capacity, their resilience capacity.
So what would your message then be to the decision makers that are gathering in Dublin? How can they best shape their policies and their interventions to address those kind of gaps, not just in Chad, but in other contexts?
I think in contexts similar to Chad, where shocks are a part of life, where shocks are so frequent, there is need to change our mindset. There is need for development and humanitarian actors to work together and to look in the long term, because responding year on year to shocks that happen, it doesn't really help. What is needed is resilience programming to be able to build, to target the resilience capacity of those communities so that they are able to get back to looking after themselves, and so that they are able to raise their capacity to withstand those shocks and be able to continue living a normal life regardless of these shocks that have become a part of their lives.
Roger, what are your reflections on what you've heard in the first two sessions this morning, and what was the most valuable thing that you would take from those presentations?
I think the overall impression, just like the Cardinal's talk just now, is that I think for the first time, we're not, whenever we discuss resilience, having 101 different definitions. I think people understand what is being attempted, and that is to address why people are vulnerable, focus on vulnerability, whether it's the socio-economic environment, whether it's the governance, political inclusion. But that has to be allied with risk management. Yeah? So earlier, better responses before coping capacities are eroded. So that's excellent. And then it gets down to sort of how that's done. I think there hasn't been too much divergence in the room of the objectives. I mean, certainly I think there might be, from an EU perspective, we tend not to look at hazard, it's the vulnerability part, because people are vulnerable to multiple hazards at different times. I think, so that's good. I think then also we're seeing that people are accepting that you have to work differently, multi-level, multi-sectoral, together, longer term, that it is also, there's a role for humanitarian, there's a role for development, we need to work together. And I liked the point you made just now, particularly that in a lot of these places, it's trying to encourage and work with governments to to work better for their people, because I think governance is a massive issue in many of these places. Takeaways, I mean, I will have some comments on whether or not we can, development can actually be applied within conflict areas or very, very fragile areas. I think the policy priority at the moment must be for protracted crisis, and this is where our policies are changing. We're going to look at much more collective system-based approaches to try and address the drivers of fragility, to try and get more stability, to try and actually stop any further deterioration, whilst at the same time maintaining humanitarian principles.
How do you, when you say much more collective systems, how do you see that coming about?
I think, well, at the moment, we just, I think, because the world has sort of changed and recognized all these requirements, whether it's what people mentioned, World Humanitarian Summit, we have a whole load of World Humanitarian Summits, Sendai, and so we have all the commitments, which I think are absolutely right, but certainly, for example, for the Commission, the European Union, we've got an agreement prioritizing fragility, stability, to have 6 Nexus pilot countries. This was only agreed in June, where we are going to try and look at, can we have a collective appraisal of European services with member states, with the UN, with civil society, to really try and understand the dynamics in a place, to see where we can get these famous sort of complementary outcomes, so that we can try, where there are gaps, gaps that create these weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Now that process is starting. A letter has gone out to the EU delegations. It's been supported at the Foreign Affairs Council, but we're still sort of learning. It's going to start with an analysis using what we already have. Yeah?
Okay. Yeah. Nicola, you're in a way complementary to the ECHO process as an individual member state. What are your own reflections on the sessions that you've heard?
Okay, thanks, Margaret. And just to say it's really good to be here, and thanks to Concern and Alliance 2015 for initiating this meeting. I think it's really important for learning and to share our expertise on this really critical issue. I missed the first session, so my sincere apologies for that, but I did come in on the second session. And just, I think for me, what really is coming out is, and very importantly, that this is not something new we're dealing with. It really is building on, years and years, I think somebody said it earlier, years and years of work looking at the sustainable livelihoods approach, but we're also looking at a vulnerability approach. And from an Irish Aid perspective, we have worked over many years on these different approaches. And in our latest policy in 2013, you'll see where, one of the major goals that we have is reducing hunger and strengthening resilience. And, since then, like many agencies here, we have spent considerable time and energy internally in looking at what does that actually mean in practice. So I think it is bringing it down to practical action. Where we've put a lot of efforts and where I felt there was, synergy coming from the various presentations earlier is around understanding the context in which we are working much, much better than we have done heretofore. And I think, as Roger was saying, the interface of all the different systems within that context, be it political, social, environmental, and really interrogating that and understanding it. I think for me, one of the things that didn't come out at the sessions earlier, and you mentioned it, was that whole issue of weak governance and the whole issue of political economy. And we in Irish Aid are, I suppose, as the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade, it is our bread and butter to understand the politics of a particular situation. But what we've learned is that really needs to be brought right down to the local level. Who makes the decisions? Who has access to the resources? And how are people interfacing? And the impact of that on individuals and communities. And how are we designing our programs to actually reflect that and to be able to operate in that context? Because often we decide or design a program in a certain context, that context can change quite quickly, and we don't necessarily change with it. So again, I heard, and I really liked the emphasis on flexibility and having that flexibility to respond to the context in which we're operating.
How do you think, Nicola, is Ireland's resilience agenda going to be fostered, given the number of humanitarian crises that seem to be cropping up more and more? Like you had Simon Coveney out talking about Yemen there recently. The scale of the things that are happening that are demanding immediate attention.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it's the approach that we adopt in those contexts. I think what we have been looking at is the different contexts in which we are operating. And I think the OECD have a very good spectrum of looking at crisis to resilience, and that different countries can be on that spectrum at different points in their development, acknowledging that they can fall back into crisis or move forward into a more resilient state. And if you look at the different contexts in which Ireland is supporting development or having a humanitarian response, the way we've seen it is there's the core set of really the crisis countries. There's another core set of fragile but stable contexts, and they would be a lot of what we term our key partner countries in sub-Saharan Africa. And then you've got the more resilient or more robust countries, and these are emerging economies such as South Africa and Vietnam, which their institutions and their governments governance would be a lot more robust than some of the other countries. But it's acknowledging that none of this is stable and that it is fluctuating. And what we're looking at is different strategies being deployed depending on the context in case. There are going to continue to be situations which demand an immediate and humanitarian response, a crisis response. But there are other longer-term protracted crises where a humanitarian response will continue to be needed. But it's how you deliver that humanitarian assistance that can shore up, strengthen the systems, focus on building individual and community capacity for longer term intervention. So it depends on how you approach the situations that you're in. And I think Roger mentioned the World Humanitarian Summit, and that was a huge event for the global community, but in particular for us in Irish Aid, we put huge effort into our preparations across government for that event. And we made very significant, I think we were one of, if not the only country to do an Irish Humanitarian Summit in advance of the World Humanitarian Summit. So we brought collective stakeholders across Ireland together in preparation for that, and to make very significant commitments around the key outcomes of that, around localization, around shifting our humanitarian assistance to multi-annual, to introducing a degree of flexibility into our humanitarian assistance and giving the partners the flexibility to respond in different contexts. And since the World Humanitarian Summit, which really was only last year, it was May or June in 2016, so it wasn't that long ago, we've actually made a number of changes internally in our operations to introduce these. We're incentivizing our partners to work with local actors to build local capacity. We've introduced longer term, more predictable funding for our humanitarian assistance, and we have started to link our development and humanitarian streams of funding for Irish international NGOs working in both spheres, including many of the organisations represented here today. So we're really so from a policy perspective and operationally, we're really pushing that agenda quite forward. So in terms of the longer term, these are the type of changes, to me, that will yield benefit going forward. You're probably aware also that Simon Coveney has really challenged us, because he has announced on Budget Day that we would produce a new development policy within the year. So we will be looking at all of these issues in that context, but I think what we will be pushing for is a longer term vision, not a cyclical change every 3-4 years, that we will be looking for that longer term vision and some of this flexibility and operational changes to be sustained over that time.
Okay, thank you, Nicola. I want to bring in Maurice there. Maurice, there's been a fair bit of talk about, the different contexts in which people are operating, the different crises that people are facing, and obviously one of the more overarching crises is the issue of climate change. From what you heard this morning, how do you see the work that you're doing interfacing with resilience programming? How do you see them linking in?
I suppose when I look back, because I want to know what I got myself into, I look back at the report of the event held in 2013, and a statement that struck me was that it spoke about the new realities of climate change. And if you look at the year we've just had, it is a reality, and I don't think, maybe in 2013 we were a bit naive, it wasn't a new reality then either. But I was in Fiji in October for the pre-COP. 31% of Fiji's GDP was wiped out with Cyclone Winston. At COP, I spent a lot of time with Agnes Lena, a Samburu woman, a pastoralist from northern Kenya, who told me about all the animals flooded away, killed by floods. So I think we're in a new state of affairs, and we can't ignore climate change in our work, in our thinking. It is creating a new normal. It is impacting the way we work. It is increasing the need for resilience, for us to look at resilience, for us to consider what makes people vulnerable and how we build our resilience to the impacts of climate change. And it was very much evident from COP, both from our development and climate aids discussions, which the foundation was involved in, and the overall discussions within the Conference of Parties, where people were talking about resilience, the need to build resilience, and how how the global actions need to look at resilience more. So I think it's now across everyone, and I don't think any of us can actually look at a program without thinking of the climate impacts on it.
I mean, I was in Nicaragua when COP was going on, and Nicaragua just signed up to the deal, you know, like a week or two beforehand, having said they wouldn't because they were so annoyed about loss and damage and so on. But I mean, a lot of the discussion there was, you know, we have to get involved in this because we're going to get money out of it. You know, we have to sign up to it because we'll get access to funding. I mean, is there, apart from the streams of funding that come from the likes of ECHO and from Irish Aid, is this fresh funding, Global Climate Fund, going to make a difference in terms of this resilience building?
That's a tough question. I think there is the need for the increased funding, and we know the 100 billion a year, that's the Green Climate Fund, and all these new streams that are promised, but I also think we need to make our current funding smarter and work smarter with what we have. And if we're not taking climate into account in our development and humanitarian programming, then it's a wasted opportunity. It's like when I worked with Breda 10, 12 years ago when we were talking about HIV. Back then, if you didn't take HIV, it was impacting so much in your other programs, it was a wasted investment. So I think we need more funds to be able to deal with the climate impacts, but we also need to work smarter with the funds we have to make sure they're climate resilient.
Just talking about the scale of funds and so on, Simon, you pretty much suggested, I think in your presentation earlier, that really, you know, millions here and millions there just doesn't really cut it when it comes to resilience. I think you mentioned billions, and that a lot of projects are tinkering around at the household level or at a very, very, very low level. I mean, what's the answer to that? What's the money is there.
No, the money's not there.
Well, some of the money is there.
No.
But is it working effectively?
Well, let's be clear. First of all, the money's not there. I mean, you sometimes get these huge announcements. I don't know, the US, for example, and I'm not taking a pot at them. They're saying, we're going to invest massively in resilience. I can't remember that, you know, they'll announce 1 billion over 3 years for, you know, I don't know, the Horn of Africa or something. And whenever these announcements are made, I do my back of the envelope calculations. Because I like putting things into context. And I remember one of their biggest announcements, it worked out at $3 per capita. This is the aid. Now, if we think that kind of people are sitting there with nothing, and I'm at least going to give them $3, you know, that might, well, at least it's something. But you actually, there is an economy going on even without us. The idea that people wouldn't even notice an extra $3 is kind of crazy. Now, that doesn't mean you can't do anything with that money. But what it does mean is, if you think that you are going to be the one to deliver resilience, and you are going to be the one to deliver capacity, you're living in a fool's world. Which is absolutely fine, because it keeps our industry going, and we all, you know, have jobs and whatever, and thank you, my kids, you know, eat very nicely and so on. That's all great. But if we actually think we're going to make a difference, no. I mean, at the moment, we're living in a world where, as far as I know, the statistics are that kind of poverty has never been so low. Yeah? Things are great. You know, and we love to use this phrase, hard-won development gains, because it makes it sound as though we had something to do with it. And it's, you know, it's all about the change in the economy in China and in India and, you know, in those kind of things. Those are the processes which really matter. So we've got a small amount of money. We've got to use it very, very strategically, because we can't create opportunities, but we can help to make sure that the people who are some of the people who are left behind by opportunities might be able to take more advantage of them. We might have some ability to help convince, not to pressure, because our money is too small to pressure, but to convince that maybe governments can make a difference. They could spend their money differently. I mean, if you look at how much governments spend, even the poorest governments, you know, look at the amount of government spending, it dwarfs ours. So I think that lots and lots of progress is being made in the world, and we can have a role to play. But if we don't start with us, yeah, if we start with us and our projects and our money, then I think that's hubris, which is dangerous for us. And it's not so much dangerous for the people we want to help, it's just irrelevant, because it condemns us to irrelevance. If we want to be relevant, we've got to really start with what's going on in a local economy, what are the forces of change, and looking for, well, what is my role within that, rather than What do I need to do to bring resilience and development?
Is that, Roger, part of the thinking? I mean, behind your plan with the 6 countries to try and do something more specific and wider?
I think it's the general global direction. I think there is some huge positive movement when we see sort of the World Bank suddenly sort of like targeting, you know, the IDA 18 to sort of like try and address situations of vulnerability with some serious money. I mean, you know, whether it's the billion they're putting into Yemen or whatever to stop sort of like deterioration. I think then the idea is to have that analysis that Simon's talking about, to understand what are the linkages, what are the opportunities, what are the barriers, and what incentives can we give. And I think, and the other, you know, we talk about humanitarian development nexus, the sort of the point that has been stressed by the new communication is including the political weight as well, to try and persuade governments, to try and work with governments. And I think Simon is also totally right to recognize the limitations. I think on a narrow, I mean, the way I look at it is counting the individuals, but how many MiG-27s in that? I mean, at one point, the humanitarian ECHO support to Yemen was the same as one fighter plane that other people are providing for them, and it's just inadequate. So yeah, finding incentives is extremely difficult.
Can I ask what those 6 pilot countries are? Because I'm not familiar with this.
Okay, let's go there. Chad, Uganda, Myanmar, Sudan. Yeah, no,
Oh, this is like a trick question.
Nigeria, and I think Iraq.
And
Iraq.
are they picked because what's the logic for picking them?
They
Is
were
it that
picked.
they have
This
scope
is an initiative with member states. So they were picked after discussions with EU delegations, with member states and countries, because it has to be a locally led process. So it is where there are opportunities for better cooperation, coordination, where people thought there might be an added value to what they're already doing, because we don't work in a vacuum. I mean, every one of these countries, there are reconstruction strategies, there are donor conferences, or whatever. So this was meant to, and they didn't want to see it as a burden. At the same time, there were there are countries, let's say like Somalia, where, you know, our record there said, no, of course, you know, we need to try and work more collectively. We're in the middle of trying to avert a near famine. So until we actually know what this means, we'll stay on the outside.
Right. And Nicola, how do you see Ireland playing a role in this sort of plan?
Well, in particular, we are engaging specifically in Uganda, and we have a very strong mission and a very strong program there, and we have put our hands up in terms of working very closely with the delegation in Uganda on this on the program there, and we've done a lot on both the humanitarian situation in Uganda with the South Sudanese refugees, but also in very difficult and complex environments working in Uganda, particularly in the north east in Karamoja. And we are, you know, we have a very concrete program there. So one, it'll be supporting the work of ECHO in Uganda and learning from that, but also bringing our own learning to it.
Okay. I want to move back to the issue of nutrition and hunger just briefly, I think, because it was such a theme of this morning's discussion. And it seems that sort of the learning and the knowledge on that seems to be further advanced. Now, this is to me as an outsider than maybe on some of the other topics. I was going to ask actually, I was going to ask Nicola, but you've just answered a question, so I should probably ask somebody else. I suppose the hunger was a big theme I think at your last roundtable. That was the main theme of it, and Ireland took a big role in sort of leading that. How do you think that whole policy has evolved in that meantime?
I would say, I'll answer from 2 perspectives. One, I would say, is our international standing. I think from 2008, we took a very big stand internationally on nutrition with our Hunger Task Force report in 2008, and then we were very strongly behind the setting up the whole Scaling Up Nutrition movement, and have continued to play a role, but I would say less so from a kind of high-level political perspective. And I'd say in the more recent years, what we've put a lot more effort into is delving down into what this actually means in practice. And we've done some very, very good work across the humanitarian and development sphere. And I think it was probably alluded to earlier, we've been supporting Concern in their work in South Sudan, and they've been developing a lot of very innovative methodologies with nutrition as a lens in working in the humanitarian and development that we're learning from ourselves and applying that across in different perspectives. I think what we've done as well over the last number of years is bring that kind of global movement down at the country level, and looking at national leadership and what is needed to drive forward a response to nutrition, but also at the local level what is needed. And I think there are some gains there, but there's still a huge amount to be done. And I mean, it really is a very good example of the need for joint up thinking, coherence across different policy spheres in order to get nutrition right. And it is a real challenge across the board, not only in developing country contexts, but in other contexts as well. But I think, we have done a lot of learning, and it will continue to be a major policy focus for Ireland going forward.
Roger, when you were listening this morning to the different research presentations on the issue of nutrition, there were some very positive outcomes in some of those results, and Camilla's presentation and in some of Anastasia's. And then there was this cash voucher thing, which didn't seem to work in quite a few of the places where it was tried. Is there is it a sort of a constant trial and error with some of these things? Because when cash came in first as the way to go, it seemed to be like one of these silver bullets. If you just give the people the money, it'll make it all a lot easier.
I've been working backwards. I think with ECHO, no, I mean, we are very firm supporters of the CAS approach, or the WHS commitments to that. We've helped develop this, but it has to be evidence-based and it has to be context-based. And I think we're very fortunate in ECHO that we have a very strong field network who will kick back on any imposition that, or this is not, and they're very highly experienced, that this is not suitable here. I mean, the presentations this morning, I would have been asking lots of questions as to why was it successful there or less successful in another place. Was it because the markets were less developed or whatever, or did they get was there some kind of awareness raising program that went with it? But so no, we think cash is extremely useful, very cost effective. It can give people dignity to have choices, but it is very situation specific.
Simon, you wanted to jump in there?
I'll just say a quick word about this cash programme. You're suggesting that evidence was presented that the cash programme wasn't successful. And I saw no evidence whatsoever to suggest that the cash programme wasn't successful. What I saw was evidence that the cash programme didn't have one specific impact, namely on nutrition. Yeah. Now what we don't know is why. Maybe these people spend a lot of that money on investing for the future. Maybe they were putting their kids through schools. Maybe maybe educational attendance. Yeah. Maybe. There is no evidence. In other words, we went in with our objectives, which is we want you to spend your money on food, on nutritional status. They had their priorities. Well, you know what? That's the whole point about giving people cash. Yeah. Is that they have their priorities, which might not be ours. So the idea that I give you cash to meet my objectives is already an absurd. Very, very interesting to study. I don't mean that, I'm not saying the study was absurd at all, but the idea that we can say the project wasn't successful because what I wanted them to do with the money didn't happen, I would be a very, very dangerous conclusion to draw. Yeah. And I really hope that is not the takeaway from here. Whether or not the project was successful, I simply don't know. We'd have to find out what did people do with the money and how successful were they in using it.
How well adapted is the thinking about how to tackle issues within cities. Because everything that we heard this morning seemed to be about pastoralists, or it seemed to be about remoter regions, and didn't seem to focus on the urban environment to any great extent. Would you like to pick up on that?
I think certainly from an eco-humanitarian point of view, with the extent of forced displacement, I can't remember the figures, but it's 80% in urban areas. So we're operating within cities. We're having to learn whether we are operating properly. We've been in the process of the last couple of years deciding whether we need an urban policy. And what would this be for? Issues of targeting in cities might be much harder. At the same time, there are lots of local capacities that we should be working with and strengthening. So we have been funding partners like IRC in various methodologies of service provision, or getting beneficiary feedback, protecting and protection in cities as well. How do we actually access vulnerable populations? So no, we're doing a lot of work. We're having to do a lot of work. We're having to do a lot of learning. Yes.
Urban is now the new resilience, if you want. I mean, it is very much a new buzzword, and there are conferences, every week discussing urban response, and it's good that it is on the agenda. I think the Haiti earthquake was probably a big shake-up for the humanitarian world in particular, because I think that was the first time they realised en masse that they hadn't got a clue what they were doing, because it was a town, and all their normal categories, if you like, didn't apply. So it's not to say that, urban sorted, but the idea that people recognise there is a problem here and we need to think about it, I think has been well achieved. I think there's been good progress to that extent.
Maurice, is there any sort of opportunities within the urban environment from a climate point of view? Are there opportunities if there's going to be new programs to do them in a climate smart, in an environmentally friendly way?
I'm going to pick up the first point around the displacement. In the first instance, was something my colleague is just on the way back from Mexico today from the second phase of the Global Compact on Migration for Safe and Orderly Migration. And one of the areas...
For safe what?
Safe and orderly migration.
Orderly.
So it's a global compact coming out of the New York Declaration.
Another complex, another declaration.
Yeah. Another one. There's going to be a refugee compact and a migration compact, which are both going to be negotiated over the next year. And one of the areas the Foundation is very much interested in is within the migration compact that climate is recognised as a driver of displacement. And also that people's rights in that process are respected, and that people who are displaced because of climate change or the impacts of climate change have particular rights that are not being met at the moment. And the compact has to identify these and very much respect them. So for example, cultural rights. If you're from a small island that's currently going under, your ancestral burial grounds are going under, you can move, but you don't take your culture with you. So it's how do we grapple with those challenges in climate displacement and when we're seeing more and more people being displaced across borders because of climate. So that's something that's of interest to us over the next year as we work towards this compact being adopted next year. In the urban area, I'm sure there is, and I kind of would have to go back to previous work, I suppose, as opposed to the work with the Foundation in terms of in an urban area, but it also comes back to sort of the principles of how we engage and looking at climate justice and how they are participatory, how we're respecting people's human rights, how we're ensuring it's gender equality. So it's nearly how the process is done and making sure that that is fair, transparent, and accountable. And that we're looking at the most vulnerable. If you look at the mudslides in West Africa earlier this year, it's always the poorest, the most vulnerable who are hardest hit. And that's at its essence, climate justice. So how do we make sure those people are looked after as we take action and as we build resilience, and are we building resilience of those most vulnerable?
Okay. At this point, we'll take a couple of questions from the floor, if people would like to ask a question.
But in terms of that affinity between resilience and nutrition, how do you now see that in the context of resilience more broadly?
I think very quickly. I mean, the first EU communication in 2012 was called Learning from Food Crises. And it wasn't just about nutrition. I mean, huge support to sun and stuff, but one of the driving factors into that was the 2007 food crisis. And what that was about, and it was mentioned this morning, I mean, that was those were food price rises that created that crisis. So there was this, so the learning part was people's vulnerability then getting programs for nutrition that were multi-sectoral, that's like health, education, and sort of employment. So it was, and then the action plan that happened in 2012 was actually covering, all situations of vulnerability and fragility, using those two sort of like driving what are the factors of vulnerability? Can we, should we focus on the most vulnerable, and that we do, and that's carried on all the way through to the communication that is now. I think the principles from the action plan that were set out in the communication are still there, but what we want is actually bigger commitments and actual more action on the ground. I think there's been an amazing change in what happened as a result of those policies. I mean, when we see whether it's social protection systems that are shock responsive, when we see humanitarians, actually, I mean, ECHO last year, we provided some money through the PNSB. If we have the EU trust funds that have levels of flexibility built in and also predictability, where we have our humanitarian responses in countries like Bangladesh that we followed up by DevCo, so development programs to actually provide livelihood support to people. And then, then really taking it even further for El Nino, the El Nino EU response, which, I can't remember whether it's 520 million or whatever, half of it was for preparedness rather than just responding, this whole idea of preemptive, predictable action. So nutrition is still there. Nutrition is an excellent indicator. That's a personal opinion. It is, but and we also see it as linked to all these other initiatives. So if we take SIND project at the moment, we're working with the World Bank of doing, CMAM, community managed acute malnutrition in SIND, but also trying to get the social protection system there to be shock responsive. So it's still very much the central part of it.
I just want to slightly challenge some of the thinking a little bit. I mean, we are perhaps guilty of always falling into a narrative of people are very poor, they move to cities, and then cities are a problem that we have to deal with. And I think, meanwhile, in the real world, people move in and out of cities, yes, and they move in and out of small towns. And I think we need to start considering small towns as part of the solution as we think about local economies. But even also in the development world, we're very guilty of putting people in boxes, and there are urban people and there are rural people. And in reality, everybody lives their lives in some kind of a continuum where they're selling animals or going to work for a month, or they have a cousin in the city or a cousin in the countryside. So if we start thinking about those connections, both economic and social, I think we could probably get to some cleverer solutions. I'm interested in reactions, but I just thought I'd get that off my chest.
I suppose I'd be interested to know what you think of, what solutions you're thinking of, or what kind of things you're thinking of. Michelle.
Well, I mean, the most blindingly obvious is encouraging people to make better use of remittances. The other one is thinking about vocational training and where you can match people's skills with perhaps labour gaps that exist in towns. Considering how services can be delivered to follow people. I mean, we do it with pastoralists. We follow people around the drylands. Can't we, find a way to help people take their children to be educated in towns some part of the year and other parts of the year in the countryside? There are, of course, market-based solutions as well. Kind of play with some of those dynamics. You can be creative, I guess.
Does anyone want to respond to that from the panel?
I think that, that reflects probably what I was trying to say at the end this morning, which is think about the local economy. And the local economy combines the rural and the urban. So, for example, if you're in a pastoral area, don't just think about the actual livestock management of, the breeding and so on. Think in terms of the marketing, the abattoirs, the veterinary services, which can be town-based. And also the idea of the extended family, which is people need, if you want to do one thing for rural people that would help in their resilience, it would find something that they could do to make sure that one of their children can get a job in a town. Because that person will sometimes send them remittances, Sometimes we'll be the recipient of food when, when they're unemployed and can come back to. Well, sometimes we're looking after, the next generation so they can go to school. We'll help them find a job. If that family needs to migrate, that will be the first exit point and so on. So and I suppose education is a secret to that. But I think there is encouraging signs just beginning that, get out of that, this is a community. No, this is a local economy. Because your community doesn't, we might think that the community is in the village. Was it Saverio this morning was saying that we try and label people with a place, but they're never actually there much of the time. More than that, even if they were there all of the time, their family isn't. They've got people moving around across borders and so on. So if we can think more about the system, I think that would help. And they're probably encouraging signs, or maybe that's wishful thinking. I don't know.
Well, it was interesting this morning about the telecommunications thing. That I think it was Saverio was saying, that give the pastoralists proper telephone coverage, and it'll help to improve their lives in terms of being able to communicate and find out what's going on and all the rest of it.
And that's also what. If you don't mind me sort of saying something, just picking up on something, I'm not trying to pick on you, but you talked about matching skills and jobs, and that is our mentality as aid people, that we try and match people. And it doesn't work, it's never worked, because what the hell do we know about the local markets and so on? But the difference is, if you provide, for example, internet, it's an example, that gives people the ability to match it for themselves. Markets are really, really good ways of matching supply and demand when they work. Yeah. When governments try and control an economy, or NGOs try and control guide an economy, it never works. But if we provide people with tools so that they can do it for themselves in their own ways and so on, there's a much better chance of it. Sometimes it'll crash, but you know what? That's life.
It is looking at innovative solutions and using technology. And I think, that's quite a cliche in lots of respects, but if you do create the space for creativity, it's there. And you do provide the tools, it's there. And at times, these key principles, which are listening to what people want and need and supporting them to get it. But we get very caught up in our planning frameworks and putting in place results frameworks. And if we can't actually achieve what we set out to achieve, we keep pushing to achieve it, even though the context just changed quite significantly. So that flexibility and, that ability, I suppose, to be reflective and to pull back a bit is much needed.
There was some talk this morning about, making more use of local NGOs and local capacity. And then, I was talking to somebody from one of the agencies who was saying that, it's sometimes very difficult for these agencies to reach the reporting standards and requirements that they need to have. Are you guys considering being more flexible about that sort of thing to give these local NGOs a chance to?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I think capacity development is hugely needed, particularly in local NGOs, but also in, as was mentioned also earlier, in local governments. That they don't have the systems or even the practical supports or the capacity to deliver what's required. And that is long-term investment. And I think that's where, it's not just a 3-year project or a 3-year investment, it is long-term. And it's investing in people and it's investing in systems. And we are very much in support of that. But and I think going forward, that is, a significant area that further attention is needed in terms of, what is doable and what can be achieved.
What about from the ECHO perspective?
From ECHO, as the humanitarian office, yes. We've signed up to WHS localization, having a certain percentage, I can't remember what the target is off the top of my head, of local actors who put their lives on the line for us. It's also strategically in keeping what we want to do. If we want an earlier response, so an early response before people sort of suffer, before coping capacities are eroded, means a local response. So people, and that either implies local capacities, but it also implies investments in preparedness to be able to do that. So.
Okay.
Margaret, can I just
sure.
Simon was saying, what do we know? And that very much came to my head about listening to local voices. And in Bonn, it was a great kind of movement towards listening to local communities and people at the front line. And I think it was influenced a lot by Fiji and their approach of Talanoa, which is listening with empathy and bringing people together. And I think it's very much, you were saying, Nicola, like our job should be to make the connections and to bring the new technology, but also to listen to what the need is, to what's happening in the communities and what they want and what their solutions are, and valuing traditional knowledge. And I was thinking back to when I was in Zambia, and there's the Baratsi floodplain, and that floods, it has done for centuries on an annual basis, and they had canals all over across the floodplain. Those had got blocked up, those were not used for various reasons. And concern came in and said, what's the problem? Why is there flooding? Why is there increased flooding? And the community was able to say, these aren't working anymore. Canals don't work, we don't have tools, we haven't organized ourselves. And it's a very simple solution that the community already had and knew about. And they just needed a little helping hand to make it work more efficient. And sometimes I think as big NGOs or donors, we come in, we have the solution. But the solutions are often there, and I think it's more like, what do we know? Like we need to listen more to communities and more to what's happening and value their knowledge.
You're looking a bit skeptical there.
No, I'm not skeptical. I'm it's what I think things are always more complicated than we would like them to be, and it's easy to get to package them nicely. And yeah, I mean, I'm very much arguing in favour of the idea that we should stop trying to micromanage. We should be facilitated. We should see where there is a particular catalytic role that we can play, and people will take it in their own direction. We sometimes, though, have to consider what will we do when people go in a direction that we... Well, let me give you an example of a project I heard about a long time ago. I don't think this is apocryphal. I think it is true, but it doesn't really matter. It was in Madagascar, and credit was given to farmers to buy fertilizer to improve their rice yields. So the farmers all took the credit, but they had far better local knowledge than we do as outside experts, and they know what the real determinant of the rice yield is, and it's the ancestors. So they were... So they spent the money, on the whole, on the far more effective than this fertilizer stuff, and they bought bags of cement to build much better graves for their ancestors. Because if they did that, then their ancestors would appreciate the respect and pay it back, and they would get better rice yields. I didn't see a randomized controlled trial. That might have been interesting.
Probably did.
But okay, so the question is this, is that fine by us? That their local knowledge, we kind of go, you know what, you've got a different worldview to us, but that's what, you know, that's kind of, it's your, or do we go, local knowledge is fine as long as it agrees with mine. And I'm not being cynical, I think there is I think again and again and again, people don't share our worldview, and why should they? I don't share theirs, they don't share mine. You know, there's no reason why they should. How far are we prepared to go in saying, I'm going to give you resources, do with it what you want, and how far is it around, well, I'm going to put limits on it. And I'm raising it as a problem, that it's, if you like, it's a moral dilemma, and I've got no easy answer.
You any ideas on that? Would you sign off on some proposal from Madagascar?
Because I think so like our red line is actually responding to people's needs in humanitarian. So we will not, let's say, support a local NGO if we don't have the confidence that they'll actually do the life-saving that we require and deal with the immediate needs. Which is why I mentioned we need to invest in the preparedness so that we actually get people up to the standard so that this is the best way of responding in situation X.
Right. What about you, Nicola? Would you sign off on the ancestors' graves?
Well, I do think
we need a bit of levity at this point.
Yeah, honestly, indeed. If it was me personally, is one question, and if it's Irish Aid, it's a different. When we have to be accountable to the Irish taxpayers, so I suppose you could get some correlation with the fairy forts and the farming community in wherever in Ireland, up in County Leitrim. But no, I mean, I think obviously we operate within a system and a context, and we have to ensure accountability for Irish taxpayers' money, or we're going to lose support for what we're doing. I do think, though, and I mean, I think that's a very, very good example that Simon has raised, but it is, how can you ensure that people can access resources for what they want to do? And that's a different question, and how you go about doing that. So it's not necessarily going into this community who want to build up their ancestral plot and saying, no, I'm sorry, I'm not giving you money for cement, but I'll give you money for your fertilizer. But how can you actually build a system where they can access resources to do what they want? So it's not us telling them what they do, but we're putting up a system, or helping assisting to put in place a system where they can access resources, and then they can decide to do what they want. It's not us giving them the money to do one thing or another, yeah? Because I think that's where I would come from, and obviously accountability for our taxpayers' money, and I wouldn't see that as a role necessarily for a bilateral organisation such as ourselves.
In a program we are implementing in Honduras, we are quite our own resilience building model that is working quite well in terms of how you actually get to recover knowledge from traditional knowledge that is being lost, and how you can, for example, get climate change adaptation measures from local indigenous communities, and get all that knowledge and transform that into capacity building that goes up to the local authorities' adaptation plans, and actually up to the national level. So it's my point is, are we really doing all we can in terms of actually learning from that knowledge?
For me, I suppose the simple answer is no. And I think if I was to ask my friend Agnes from Northern Kenya, she'd also say her traditional knowledge has not been used enough as well. And I think there is opportunities, and I take, like, whoever signed off in the program, you just spoke about Simon, would have questions about their ability as well. But I suppose, I think there's things we can do, and I'm not saying that there's one side is right or one side is wrong. I think there's a way to marry the two trains, and I think UNESCO are doing a lot of work on how we blend science and traditional knowledge and come up with better answers for all, and how we work on that. And I think in COP we saw the agreement of the local communities and indigenous peoples platform, which is an attempt to move forward with how we blend local communities and indigenous peoples' knowledge with what we know already, and see how we come out with better results for all. And if you look under the SDGs, we've Goal 13B, which looks about the inclusion of women and local communities in climate action. So we have all these processes that try to get local communities in, but we just need to action them a bit more, I think, and see how we listen.
Roger, you wanted to...
Yeah, no, I don't think we are doing enough, and I've got lots of sort of like personal experience of sort of where in a cyclone response in Andhra Pradesh, you know, people, the one thing that probably would have been needed were these bamboo rat traps. You know, they used to make locally, but there weren't enough like leaves to make them. This had a huge effect. So if we spoke to local, but the point I really want to make is we've done quite a lot of work in Latin America as ECHO with the DIP ECHO program in sort of like either reviving or trying to expand on indigenous methods. Yeah? But we have a problem, and this is a general problem when we're trying to build preparedness as well, is that too often we get very process-related sort of either project proposals or case studies. So, for example, we did a resilience compendium I think in 2014 or 2015, and we had lots of examples of indigenous knowledge. And there was only one, it was actually from the Philippines, that actually said what the change in yield was for sort of a different approach to growing rice. Now, that's the type of information that I can then use to justify another investment. And this is the thing which I find really hard. We know that risk reduction is good. We know that preparedness is good. But we have to try, we still have to go before directors, go before the people that decide on budgets, and say, your money is better spent in this, doing it this way, than in responding. And so somehow, and I don't know the answer, I think the swift development in which we have as one of our has an outcome indicator, where we ask partners, partners are asked to say, what difference will it make? We're not going to tell you what, it's not up to us to say what the indicators are, but it would be really useful because we know a lot of things work, we have to persuade others, and there are other, sort of like competing priorities.
What you need is someone like the rigor of Anastasia to work on one of these things. Yeah.
Can I say a quick word? I'm a little hesitant about this idea of traditional knowledge versus scientific knowledge. It worries me. And I'll tell you...
You've just been the one talking about the ancestors in the grave.
No, I know one moment. Exactly.
It worked.
I didn't say they were against each other.
No, I didn't. No. One moment.
It was before.
No, this categorization that there is scientific knowledge and that there is traditional knowledge, I think is slightly worrying because it's as though we know things in a different way. You know what we don't? We know things that we don't. When a local farmer has been looking at his yield and noticing that every time he plants it in a different way or whatever it is, the yield goes up or goes down, that is knowledge based upon observation. Yeah. That is no less scientific than anything that I do or a scientist does. Yeah. It might be less accurate measurement or less precise measurement, but it's not less scientific. We fetishize traditional knowledge. Let's face it, there is no such thing as traditional knowledge anyway. If you look at what farmers are growing today, I did some research once years back in northern Mozambique. It was actually, I was looking when I was working with Concern. And it was supposed to be a part of remote part of Mozambique where everyone said there's never been any change there. And when you started talking to the farmers and you said, well, so what's changed? They go, nothing's changed over generations. When you got below the surface, these guys, in a period of 20 years, had changed their main staple food crop twice and changed their main cash crop 4 times. Nothing that they did was based on traditional knowledge, because what they were growing were not food crops or cash crops. Even in their grandparents' time, they had developed new. Why not call it scientific knowledge? So I'm not against. My comment wasn't to say that we shouldn't value what
it's
people
how
know.
It's described.
Just by calling it traditional knowledge sets us up on a higher plane. Right. To their knowledge, and I'm sorry, it's not. Sometimes they have and some a lot of what science knows, what we call science, turns out to be wrong, because that's the whole point about science, is it's always defeasible. You can always discover that disprove your hypotheses, and a lot of what they know will also turn out to. But if it's based on observation and thinking and rationality, their knowledge shouldn't be. It's not that we should value it as something different to ours. Knowledge doesn't really have this ethnic cleansing of knowledge. I think is a little bit. I don't think we should get ethnic purity of knowledge rather.
I suppose let's just go on a different track for a while. Nicola, I mean, after what you've heard today and what you're dealing with on a daily basis, what's the most intractable issue in all of this? What's the biggest obstacle? Is it the amount of money? Is it the role of the local governments? Is it what's the toughest nut to crack, do you think?
There are a number of them, I would say, but I think partly would be influencing change at a policy level in some of the countries in which we're operating. And that is really, really challenging. And that is working within the political system and within the political economy of the countries in which we're operating. And that can be a real challenge to get that level of change. And the work that's done at an individual, community, local level needs to really inform that and needs to help inform that change. But I think for me, some of those, because a lot of the challenges that we face are based on weak governance or bad governance or challenging, we don't necessarily agree with some of the policies in government, or we would see it in a different way, or if resources were spent differently or allocated differently, the outcome would be different. And actually getting that change, and it's that level of change at a government level, to me, is a real, real challenge. And I think that comes back to my earlier point about greater political engagement. And I think that's where we're seeing ourselves going, that development is political, ultimately. It is political. We've always said that, but we need to be more political in terms of how we do our development. And that's where we're going in the future and really trying to push that forward. But I think that is it's not easy, it's very, very tough. And that's one of the key challenges, I would say.
And when you
for us.
say become more political, how does that play out in practice? Is that kind of you reward good behaviour, or what's the mechanism?
Yeah,
for this?
I think one of, and I think it was Connell mentioned it earlier, is being much more adaptive to the context and to be able to be much more flexible in saying, well, if this is not going to work, but we can work here, let's move with that particular aspect, be it an individual, be it an institution, and be able to have that flexibility to change depending on the context. And it's also engaging more politically in the countries in which we operate. So where we would have a presence, it's easier because you'd have an embassy and you'd have colleagues there, and you can work with the EU delegation, and you can have more of a political influence. In countries where we're not present, that's more challenging. And I think then it's looking at ways in which we can have more of an influence through, be it through other organisations or partnerships, or be it through regional institutions. So again, it really is thinking through in a more political way how change can happen.